Hello, everybody. Today is Monday, November 11th, 2019. My name is Matt Fury, and this is The Rough Cut. Hello once again, dear listeners. Welcome to another Rough Cut podcast. I hope these shows have become a welcome distraction for you. Maybe something to keep you company in the car, perhaps during that long commute from Santa Clarita to Los Angeles or wherever you're commuting from. And two, no matter how or where that you listen to these, I'm thankful that you do, and I hope you get a lot out of them. Today's episode is absolutely loaded with stuff to get. That's because it's not just about a single movie, it's actually about a whole lot of movies, all consolidated into one really great book written by a truly great editor. Paul Hirsch is the editor, and the book is called A Long Time Ago in a Cutting Room Far, Far Away, My 50 Years Editing Hollywood Hits, Star Wars, Carrie, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, Mission Impossible, and more. And in that one little word more is a lot of other memorable films. How memorable? How about The Empire Strikes Back, and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and Footloose, and Steel Magnolias, and Blowout, and Falling Down, and on and on and on. There's just a lot of great movies in that 50-year career. And in that 50 years, Paul has worked with over 25 directors. Brian De Palma, of course, who Paul worked with on 11 different pictures, and obviously George Lucas with Star Wars. And then you have directors like John Hughes and Herbert Ross and Joel Schumacher. And then you take all those directors and all those movies over all those years, and you have a book that is tailor-made for anyone with an interest in editing, filmmaking, and even movies in general. On top of that, it's just a really entertaining read. I enjoyed it immensely, and so much so that I went out and bought 10 copies to give away to all of you. So what I'm going to do is that anyone who subscribes to the blog site for this podcast, the one where you sign up to get notified anytime there's a new video or a new podcast, you're automatically going to be entered to win a copy. And to make it all even easier, I'll put a link right in the show notes that will take you right to where you need to go to enter. Just couldn't be easier. And since we're entering the season of giving, I'm going to let the contest run until the end of the year. So anyone who subscribes up through December 31st, 2019 will be entered. And I'm even going to try and get Paul to sign it for you. He said that he would, and I believe him, but I don't want to put that on his shoulders. So should you win, and 10 of you will, I will ask Paul at that time to sign it for you. Even if you enter to win a copy, you should definitely buy one. It's that good. Plus, if you win, you can just give away your first copy to a friend as a gift. And there's nothing wrong with a little regifting. Just swap the dust jackets. I won't tell. Rough Cut listeners, I give you editor, Paul Hirsch.
It's a whole series. It's a very good piece. It's in the op-eds of New York Times today.
Well, speaking of some very good writing, your book is almost out. You must be pretty excited that it's after all that work you put in it. It's almost here.
Yeah, I can hardly believe it. It's been a long haul.
Well, when you're trying to encapsulate a 50-year career, you got to start somewhere. So let's go back to the beginning, if you wouldn't mind. The early days in New York, really fascinating stuff. These days, it seems a lot of kids, for lack of a better term, already have an idea of what they want to do, and they have access to the tools to be a filmmaker, to be an editor.
Right.
And they have a good idea of I want to go to film school. It seems that, editors in years past, like yourself, have a collegiate experience, but not necessarily film school. Could you tell us a little bit about your college career and how it might have ultimately set you up for a career in editing?
So I went to the High School of Music and Art in New York. It's a public high school that focuses on the arts. And I was a music major and played the timpani. And then I went to Columbia thinking that I would be sort of interested in pre-med. What I didn't realize was how poorly a high school that focuses on the arts prepares you for science courses at Columbia. So, I realized I hit a wall immediately in science and math because I didn't have the preparation for it. So I had to rethink my path in college, and I wound up being an art history major, and it was a fantastic experience. And ironically, we would sit in the dark looking at images projected on the wall and discuss them. And so it was like sort of a preparation for being an editor. But at the end of my senior year, I needed 2 more courses to complete the requirement for my degree. And there was a program in Paris where I would take 2 courses for 6 weeks, and that would complete my requirement for a degree. And while I was in Paris, I had half the day to myself, and I started noticing around the left bank were all these art houses that were showing American films from the 30s and 40s. And I'd go see the movies, and they were great. They were really terrific. And then they had a festival of Orson Welles films at the Cinematheque. And I went, the first night was Citizen Kane. Now, I'd heard the title, but that was all I knew about it. I mean, it was a famous movie, but I went to see it, and the place was packed. And the film started, and there were no subtitles. It was not subtitled in French. And I knew that most of the people there, I doubted that they all spoke English, but I think they came just to see the cinematography and the shots and the staging and the editing and the music, and just to experience the film even without the words. And when we got to the end and the ending was revealed to me, I was devastated. I was just in shock. It was just an overwhelming experience. And I went back the next night and I saw The Magnificent Ambersons. Then I saw The Lady from Shanghai, The Touch of Evil on Thursday, and on Friday they were showing either Othello or Macbeth, I forget which, and you couldn't get near the place because Wells was going to appear in person. So then I went back to New York and I started architecture school in the fall, and the courses I was taking seemed very dry to me. And I turned 21 and I decided that I had had enough school. I was facing another 4-year program to get a second bachelor's degree, and I just thought it was too much. So I thought, I'm just going to try and get a job. And at that time also, a friend of mine who had been a Columbia student was editing a little documentary, and I went up to visit him, and he had a setup in his apartment, and he had a bench with rewinds and synchronizer and splicers and a moviola. And it's the first time I'd ever seen a moviola. Now, in 1966, there was no videotape. It hadn't been invented yet, at least not for the consumer. The only way an average person could see a moving image in those days was either at the movies or on television, which was always live. So here was this machine that you could run film on, and you could stop on a frame, and you could see the individual still picture of which the film was made up. And then, miracle of miracles, you could back up, and you could go forward slowly or fast. You could rewind slowly or fast, and I just thought this is the most fantastic tool I'd ever seen in my life. So I decided that I was going to pursue that. And a friend of mine, Tom Belfort, had an uncle who had a film company called Dynamic Films. And they would make industrial films. They would go shoot a race, stock car racing. They'd hired 10 cameramen for the day. And they'd shoot this race, and they'd record the announcer in the booth. And then the editors would get all this stuff and would cut together a 20-minute film about the race. I worked there for 2 weeks. My job was to replace the shipping room guy who was leaving. My job was primarily I would go to the negative cutter to deliver a work print and maybe pick up the cut negative, and then I would take the cut negative to the lab. And then at the lab, I would pick up prints and bring them back to the shipping room, and I would mount them on reels. And during my first 2 weeks there, this other negative cutter said to me, I'm looking for someone to train. Are you interested? So I went back to the office and I spoke to one of the editors. I said, what do you think? He said, well, if you did that, you'd be handling film instead of packages. So I thought, well, yeah, that kind of makes sense. So after 2 weeks, I gave 2 weeks notice, and I went off to work for this negative cutter. I worked for him for about 6 months, and I learned the whole technical end of the business, how you prepare negative for printing and why you had to drop frames. And then he turned out to be a screamer. He would just lose his temper at me all the time. And so I thought, well, screw you. And I left after 6 months. But then my mother ran into a guy at an opening of an art exhibition or something. And he was a film editor who was looking for an assistant. And she said, oh, my son's an assistant, which I was not. But I went and met him, and he hired me. And he was working at a trailer house. And his name was Chuck Workman. And he had more work than he could handle, so he started giving me little jobs to do. And then after a while, I was starting to be a regular trailer editor. I stopped being an assistant and became a trailer editor. And around that time, my brother Chuck had talked himself into a job at Universal, scouting young editing and directing talent. One of the guys that he met and thought was talented was Brian De Palma. And he proposed a project to Universal with Brian, and they rejected him. So he decided that he and Brian would shoot this picture that Brian and he had come up with during his vacation from Universal. He had 2 weeks off, so they shot this picture in 2 weeks, and Brian cut it together, and it was called Greetings. It was about young guys trying to avoid the draft. one of the actors in it was Bob De Niro. There were three main characters. So the picture needed a trailer. So they came to me and I cut a trailer for them. And I met Brian then. And the picture did fairly well. And they got the money from the distributor to do a sequel. I was hired at my brother's suggestion. And Brian and I had met and hit it off. We were very simpatico. That was how I got my first feature.
This book is eminently quotable. There's so many great quotes and there's so many great anecdotes. You don't pull any punches. I mean, I think as a reader, you were brought right in there in the moment with you in all these editing rooms with all these people.
I pulled a few punches.
I can only imagine what they would have been. But what I thought I would do, just for a little bit of fun, because it is so quotable, and this first one will be easy. I thought I'd give you some quotes from some of these directors you've worked with and to see what kind of thoughts it inspires. My first favorite is, I hate overlaps. I want to see the actor who is talking.
Well, that was Brian.
Of course.
Brian, yeah. Well, it makes sense. There are times when the actor who's listening is more interesting than the actor who's speaking. I mean, if you look at Brian's films, it's not always true that we did that, but he had a preference for that.
Well, there's also a quote from him, not just in the book, but on the front of the book. So I'm presuming that he has read the book, or at least parts of it?
Well, I don't think he would have written a blurb if he hadn't read the book. I mean, I sent him the manuscript, and he gave me a blurb, so I presume that he read it. He's not the kind of guy who would give out blurbs easily. I don't know that he's ever written a blurb for any other book, actually.
Well, that says a lot. And you really, again, you go into such great detail about your working relationship with him. I think the first quote-unquote big film the two of you did together would be Carrie.
Yes.
It might have been your fourth or fifth in your run together, if I got my math somewhat right. Lots of bold decisions made on that film and somewhat revolutionary techniques. The split-screen sequence at the end in the prom, what drove that decision and what made it challenging to edit to do it that way?
Brian had been interested in split screen in Sisters, which was our second film, in the aftermath of the murder at the beginning of the film. And Brian had, before Sisters, had been in Hollywood doing a picture called Get to Know Your Rabbit with Tommy Smothers and Catherine Ross, and Orson Welles was in it. Anyway, it's a picture that's sort of fallen into obscurity. But he fell into a political hassle with the studio and he got fired. So he came back to New York and he filmed a performance of an off-Broadway play called Dionysus in '69. And he shot the whole thing split screen. He had one camera on the audience and one camera on the performance. And split screen had always been something that fascinated him. So when he got to the prom scene in Carrie, he was always interested in the visual possibilities of the medium. And if you look at his work, it's really rather extraordinary. And how he pieces together sequences usually in visual terms, so you can follow the story without the need of dialogue or exposition. You sort of watch what's happening and you can intuit what the characters are thinking from the construction of the scene and the succession of the images. So he had designed this prom scene. The first part is shot more or less conventionally, although there's a sort of a spinning shot when Carrie's having a wonderful time. And then there's this long, elaborate tracking shot that sets up the prank where it starts on Tommy and Carrie filling out their ballots for King and Queen of the Prom, and then the ballots get picked up and then they're switched with the rigged ballots and then they're delivered over to the table with the judges, and then the camera keeps going and you see John Travolta and Nancy Allen hiding under the stage, and you see the rope coming out they're holding a rope and follow the rope up the side of the set and onto, camera goes up, this long crane shot, and then winds up directly over a bucket of blood, directly over the microphone where the class president announces that Carrie and Tommy Ross have won the election for King and Queen. So that tracking shot establishes the geography and puts all the elements in place. At that point, we go into a long slow motion sequence. I think there were about 100 setups detailing Carrie walking up to the stage, and The Amy Irving character, who had been banned from the prom, had snuck in, and she's watching, and then she sees the rope and the bucket and figures out what's going on, and she tries to intervene. And then the teacher, played by Betty Buckley, sees her and misunderstands what's going on, and she grabs her and throws her out. And all these elements are going on with no dialogue. You understand, because it's all been set up previously. So this long sequence in slow motion gets us to the point of yanking the cord and dumping the bucket of blood. At that point, Carrie snaps, and she slams all the doors shut in the gym and starts to annihilate people. And that's when it goes into split screen. So he was looking for different visual forms to tell each segment of the story. And this is so unusual. The picture is fresh today because of that. I mean, so many people, I hesitate to call them directors, but people in the job of director will sometimes just shoot the action from every angle they can possibly think of, not make any choices on the floor, but leave themselves infinite possibilities and turn all this material over to the editors without giving any guidance. So the editor has to make all the choices that the so-called director didn't make when he was shooting, and then present that and then be told it's all wrong because there are, a billion ways to cut 30 angles together, But Brian, he was making choices, and it's not that he left nothing for the editor to do. I still had a lot to do, but his intention was clear, and he made choices that pointed you in a very strong direction. And there's a great joy to sort of solve these puzzles in putting together these sequences.
Well, you actually detail in the book something about Brian's directorial style, about the POV, the point of view.
Yes.
He almost always sandwiches a POV shot. I don't want to misquote you, so I'm actually going to read from it.
Okay.
Brian built his directorial style around the point of view. In his use of the film grammar, the POV is almost always sandwiched between two close-ups. The actor looks, cut, we see what he sees, cut to the second close-up. So the actor reacts to what he has just seen, and you call it a simple formula that puts the audience inside the actor's mind without the use of dialogue.
Right. But it's like grammar, the subject, the verb, and the object. There are reasons why language is constructed a certain way, and this is a kind of a film language. It's easy to follow a story when you see somebody looks, and then just the fact of the actor looking requires the filmmaker to show what they're looking at. I mean, if somebody goes, if they look up suddenly, you need a shot up to see what they're seeing. If somebody lifts binoculars up to their face, the audience feels like, what are they looking at? And then you show what they're looking at. And if it's somebody breaking into a car, you want to cut back and see what the person's reaction is. So it's a logical sequence of images that tell a story. Why Brian chose that, he was a great admirer of Hitchcock. And if you look at Hitchcock's films, let me back up for a second. There are shots today that I don't quite understand, but that have become very popular. And they are the back of an actor's head. When I first saw it, I thought, what are they thinking? Why are we showing the back of an actor's head? And it would be like a handheld shot or, a Steadicam shot, a tracking shot, where the actor's walking in the foreground with their back to us, and we're seeing the environment they're moving through. I thought, well, okay, that saves time. You don't have to shoot. But, Brian would have shot it a reverse tracking shot showing the actor's face and intercut it with a clean point of view of where he's going. And this is the kind of thing that Hitchcock did. He would show like when Marion Crane's sister walks up to the haunted house in Psycho, there are shots of her coming up the stairs, and there are shots of her point of view as she gets closer to the house. So it's close up and reverse of the point of view. So I think Brian was influenced by that. And Brian, he's very interested in voyeurism, people watching other people. This is a constant motif in many of his films.
So obviously you've done a lot of films or you did a lot of films with Brian. One of those films was Blowout. And I was really taken aback by your description of that one in the book because you describe how you had learned an important lesson on that one. And I thought it was a great lesson for any kind of editor or any creative professional. And this was about sort of your understanding early on that this wasn't the right film for you, yet you did it anyway out of probably a lot of loyalty for Brian.
Yeah, I had problems when I read the script, and I expressed some of them to Brian, and he wasn't interested in my notes. And, this happens. I mean, no two people have the exact same sensibility. And yeah, I should have, I had criticisms about the script, and I think that the director has the right to expect his editor to be fully on board. And I probably shouldn't have done the picture, but I did. And it's interesting to me because at the time it was a failure. I went to see it. I was in the Hamptons in New York. I went to see it out there opening night, and people were booing the ending. So that was a shocker. But then, to my amazement, it's become sort of a cult classic, and people seem to overlook its flaws, which I think is great. I mean, it had a lot going for it. I was focused on the flaws, of course, because that's what editors do. We look at stuff and we think you sensitize yourself to things that ping you. What's wrong with it? It's like those games in the paper they used to have. What's wrong with this picture? There's a cow on the roof. Yeah. So you're playing what's wrong with this picture. You're looking at the picture and saying, what's wrong with this? You say, well, this is wrong, this is wrong. You're just focused on fixing the things that are wrong. And, so just to audiences today looking at the picture, they don't seem to be bothered by the things that I find to be a problem. I found to be a problem. I mean, when you're working on it, you're probably more sensitized to these things than you will be years later, but that's appropriate.
Well, it couldn't have caused too much of a rift between the two of you because you actually have the unique, you're in the unique position of saying that Brian De Palma was your wedding videographer, which I found eminently fascinating and funny. Tell me a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, well, Brian offered to film the wedding, and he borrowed a camera from Chuck Workman, and he had never used it before. And it was silent, Super 8 camera, and he worked his butt off. He got there early. He got me getting dressed. He got us signing the wedding certificate. He got us coming down. It was an outdoor wedding, so walking toward the chuppah. Chuppah is like a little house where Jewish weddings take place. And he got front angles, he got reverse angles, he got the families, and he got an insert of the foot breaking the glass, and he covered the whole thing. And he had a dozen rolls of film with him. After he'd shot roll 11, he looked at the camera and he said, I wonder what this switch does. Maybe I should shoot one roll with the switch the other way. So he did, and when we developed the film, we had 11 rolls of black leader and one roll of some stragglers at the party dancing. So it turned out that the switch was a non-reflex fader, and he had it closed the whole time. But of course, since it was non-reflex, he couldn't see it through the viewfinder. And he swore to me that it was a wonderful picture.
Yeah, I'm sure he was right. So I have another quote for you amongst all these wonderful quotes. And this one, I laughed out loud when I read this one. The quote is, mixers are people who committed terrible crimes in their former lives.
Yeah, Benny Herman.
Bernard Herrmann, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. He was sympathizing with them. It wasn't, it wasn't that he had against them. He just thought it would be a terrible life to be confined to a dark room playing stuff back and forth over and over and over again. He thought they were punished for their, former crimes.
Well, he actually factors heavily into your early years with Brian as well, even though he's not a director. In fact, I think it's objectively fair to say that you helped jumpstart his career late in his career. What was the occasion that brought about your relationship with Bernard?
I was working on a picture called Sisters that was produced by Ed Pressman, and Brian was directing. And Ed called me and he said, I need to raise money. I want to have a screening of the murder sequence for potential backers. So I knew from my experience with trailers that you have to be a bit of a showman. You can't just show stuff that's unready and say, well, it's going to have this, it's going to have that. You can imagine if we have this. People can't imagine. You have to present something that's really good. So I thought, I can't show this without music. I have to have music. I thought, what music can I use? Coincidentally, I had just seen Psycho on television. And, because I hadn't been to film school, I had to learn editing the way that, when you visit a museum and you see art students in front of masterpieces copying them. That was my approach to learning how to edit. I would see things in films, and then when I got the dailies, I would try to replicate things that I'd seen and try to make it look like a movie. So that was what I was doing. So anyway, I was watching Psycho, and I was a little concerned about Sisters because the dailies seemed to be kind of mundane. And watching Psycho, I was watching the scene where Marion Crane is being followed by a policeman after she's stolen the money. She had fallen asleep by the side of the road, and the cop sees the car stop by the side of the road. He wakes her up, and she acts very guilty, and she takes off, and he follows her. And the scene is incredibly tense. But I was watching it, and I thought, how is this scene shot? And I realized there were only 3 setups. There was a close-up of Janet Leigh, Marion Crane, driving the car. There was her point of view of the road ahead. And there was a point of view of the rearview mirror in which you saw the cop car reflected. That was it. So I turned down the sound, and it had no effect. And I turned up the sound, and the music made the scene incredibly tense. And I thought, Psycho, that's the ticket. So I went and I bought the album and transferred it to MAG and laid it in against the scene. And they had the screening, and it went very well. And Brian later wrote an article for the Village Voice where he described seeing the sequence with Benny's music for the first time. And he said the music completely transformed the scene from something he had been familiar with into something completely extraordinary. So it was that point that we decided to pursue getting him. He had moved to England. His last score for Hitchcock had been thrown out, and he was very wounded by the way Hitchcock treated him. And he left Hollywood and never went back to live. He went back to work occasionally at the end. But he was so wounded that he moved to London, and this was the first American film that had approached him in many years.
In your depiction of him, very passionate, if not at times volatile gentleman. In fact, your admiration for him and in bringing him into your project was very clear. And in that first job you had together, he kind of lashed out at you and blamed you for something. Yes. And really, you could tell how hurt you were by this, and it hurt your relationship with him, only to be somewhat fixed years later.
It was really a very wonderful relationship. His daughter told me that he was very fond of me, and it was reciprocated. I mean, he was this volatile. He was like a wounded. Somebody once said that we're all wounded 6-year-olds walking around, and some of us can handle it better than others. But he was very sensitive to slights and perceived grievances, and he was just an extraordinary man.
Well, you can tell how fortunate that you feel you are to have worked with him. And one of my favorite parts of the book, amongst the book that I enjoyed thoroughly from beginning to end, I have another quote for you that I really loved. This director said to you, Paul, is the building talking? Which, taken out of any kind of context, would confuse anybody. But who said to you, is the building talking?
That was George Lucas.
So what was Mr. Lucas inferring or referencing when he said, is the building talking?
Well, when you pre-lap a scene with dialogue, you start a scene, establishing shot of a house, and you hear the first lines of dialogue of the scene over the exterior of the house, and then you cut inside. I mean, it's a standard technique that people use all the time. George wasn't buying it. Every director has his own little preferences and tics and so forth, and things that bother one don't bother another. But I mean, that's one of the interesting things about not having a lifelong relationship with a single director like Steven Spielberg's editor or Marty Scorsese's editor. There's the good and bad about it. I mean, I've worked with some people who should not have been allowed to direct, and I've worked with some people who were very rude and insensitive. I've worked with, a number of very extremely talented, gifted artists, and that's been a joy.
You could have written an entire book or more than one just on your experience on Star Wars. I didn't want to pass over it, yet at the same time, to talk to you and not talk about Star Wars would seem just crazy. Marcia Lucas played a big part
Yes.
in bringing you in, and certainly Brian sort of coercing or coaxing you into doing it as well, and then the casting for Carrie. A lot of that stuff has been well documented in other places. But I think what was really interesting is seeing through your eyes, walking into George's house and meeting the team. Marcia Lucas, Richard Chew, Ben Burt, and of course George. What was that like for you as a still young editor in going into an environment like that?
Well, it was painless. I mean, everyone was very friendly and welcoming, and Ben hadn't done anything before. I mean, he was a few years younger than us. Richard was a few years older. He had worked on The Conversation, and he'd worked on One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Both brilliant classic films. And Marcia had done Taxi Driver, and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and Graffiti. So these were people with great accomplishments, and I felt very welcome. People out west are friendlier than people in New York. Yeah, I mean, I felt very welcome and comfortable, and it was a very easy fit. Now, this is a picture that had already been cut, so we were recutting, and I was brought in because there was a deadline. They were not going to be able to meet without my help. So you don't have time for reflection. You know what I mean? You're laying track in front of an approaching locomotive. You're not sitting there thinking about the larger issues. You're just saying, okay, what's wrong with this picture? You look at a scene. So George would not let me watch the whole film. He just had me take the next reel.
Why do you suppose that is, Paul?
I don't know. He just thought there's no time for that. Let's just focus on the immediate problem. And he was splitting his time. He would spend 3 days at ILM in LA and then 3 days up north with us in the editing room. And he would fly down Monday mornings and come back Wednesday nights. And the idea was that Marcia was sort of busy working and building the end battle, which was an enormously complicated proposition. And Richard and I were recutting the picture and sort of leapfrogging over each other when we finished the reel. If he was on 2, I would go to 3. And when he finished 2, he would go on to 4 and so forth. The approach was just to take the next scene and say, what's wrong with this scene? And sometimes it was overcut, sometimes it was too slow, and he would hold on shots for too long. And there was no particular rhyme or reason to it, but it was everything felt off. Sometimes I would have to get the proper flow to the scene, a nice rhythm, a nice pace, and make the cuts look nice. I'd have to be trimming 2 or 3 frames off the end of shots. And I had an assistant named Mike Kitchens who would come in, and I'd call him down and say, I need a new trim bin. I filled up this trim bin. Can you give me a fresh trim bin? And he'd wheel in a fresh trim bin. He'd look at this bin that I had with all these 2 and 3 frame cuts. And he'd say, what did you do? Put the film through a fan? But the approach was just, you get a scene done. Okay, that's done. On to the next. And when you're working on a film, you're building a mural that's composed of small mosaic tiles. And your work is very close up for a long time. But to really understand what you're doing, you have to step back and look at the whole thing. So you're working micro, and then you have to work macro. But for the longest time, you have to work very close up without fully grasping what the whole thing is about. So we get through recutting the picture in the micro fashion and making the scenes work individually and so forth. And then you put it up on the screen, you look at it, and certain things become apparent. I found this wonderful quote from Michelangelo. Beauty lies in the elimination of superfluity. So, when you're carving stone, you can only take away, you can't put back. So you have to be pretty sure what you're doing. But he would look at a stone and he would say, don't need this, don't need that, and he would wind up with the Pietà. He saw that in the stone and eliminated everything that didn't look like that. So not to compare our work to Michelangelo, but it's the same principle, which is that you eliminate what you don't need. And when we saw the whole picture, it sort of became obvious that there were scenes that didn't work. That, if a scene doesn't work, you have two choices. You can either try to make it work or you can just get rid of it. And the first thing you should try, in my opinion, is to get rid of it, because if you don't miss it, then you don't have to worry about trying to make it work. So there were scenes in the picture I thought didn't work, and I said, let's just try taking them out. And most of them were around the beginning, establishing Luke on Tatooine and so forth. And we took out all those scenes, and the result was a wonderful bonus, which is we got rid of scenes that we didn't need because it was full of exposition that we're going to find out later anyway. And we wind up with an organic approach to the droids landing on Tatooine and not knowing if the planet's inhabited or by whom or what. And the first sign of life we see is the skeleton of a big dinosaur or something. And then there is this transport with Jawas, and then we're led to Luke sort of organically, as opposed to just cutting to him arbitrarily in the middle of the first scene, which is how it had been. So it's this wonderful bonus of making the planet into a more mysterious place.
One of the things I always like to see come through is having people learn that an editor does so much more than just edit on a film, and that their influence can be felt in a lot of different ways. Sometimes the editor actually shows up in the picture. Sometimes the editor does some voiceover. In Star Wars, there were a lot of ways that you had that kind of impact. One of the ones that was most intriguing to me was the end sequence on the Death Star with Darth Vader's TIE fighter, and how you figured out a way to get out of a certain problem you were having there editorially.
Yeah, well, at a certain point in the battle, Vader decides to go up. He's on the Death Star, and he decides to go join the air fight. And he jumps in his ship, and he's accompanied by two wingmen. And we had a shot of the three ships taking off. And I had noticed, as a New Yorker who took public transportation to work every day, when I came to work for George, there'd be a parking lot full of cars, or a few cars. And if I saw George's Camaro there, I knew that he was already in. So I thought, oh, this is interesting. You can identify the person by their car. So then I had this thought, when Vader takes off from the Death Star, I thought he should have a distinct ship so I know which one is his. So I mentioned this to George, and he said, yeah, that's a good idea. So he went back to ILM, and they took a TIE fighter, and they folded the wings in. The simplest approach. They didn't have time to design a whole new ship for him. So they just folded the wings in. I gave, his ship a distinctive look, so you knew who was who when you saw an exterior.
So not a lot of editors can say they designed Darth Vader's TIE fighter. That's pretty cool.
I didn't design it. I just made suggestions. I'm in the suggestion business. Editors are in the suggestion business.
It's a good way to look at it. Final thing I want to talk about with Star Wars is just the importance of casting. You made an effort to call that out in the book, and how casting can really make a film. And then later on in the book, you talk about a film called Gypsies that you did with Dino De Laurentiis, where casting hurt the film.
Actually, the weaker the material, the easier it is for the editor, because there's only one good take. You use that one, whereas I did a picture with Al Pacino, and he would do 10 takes, and every one of them was different from every other, and every one of them was brilliant. So that's a real head scratcher, How do you eliminate 9 brilliant takes and go with one? So in a way, from an editorial standpoint, a bad performance is easier to edit than a good. You're not going to get good results, but it's less of a challenge because, that's not entirely true. I've done a couple of pictures where where the actor had a problem on the day and he couldn't remember his lines. And I did a pilot for a show called E-Ring with Taylor Hackford, and Dennis Hopper was in the film. And he had a terrible time one day. He couldn't remember his lines, and he kept blowing it, and just Taylor kept at it, and he never really got through a take without screwing up. But, Taylor had covered it enough, so I put it together and was able to, not doing anything extraordinary, but I just put it together in such a way that I got rid of all his fluffs and his stammers and his problems, And he looked at it when it came to loop. He looked at the scene and he said, "Oh my God." He says, "Are you doing that? Are you cutting the series?" And I said, "No." He said, "Too bad," because he was shocked that the scene looked as if I mean, it looked fine. The scene looked fine, but the actual doing of it was awful, for him. So yeah, that's what we do. Make everyone look good. That's the point. If the makeup looks bad on a certain angle, you don't use it. If the costume looks bad, you try to cut around it. If actors blinking like crazy, like Uncle Owen in the sand crawler sequence, you cut around the blinking. We're trying to make everyone look good.
I don't have a quote for him, but I'd like to jump ahead to John Hughes, who you did some terrific films with in the 80s, one of which, Ferris Bueller. We talked about in Carrie sort of doing something a little different with the split screens. In Ferris, did a couple of things that really hadn't been done before or done in a while. The first would be breaking the fourth wall, which I remember seeing the film in the theater as a kid.
Yeah.
And just how different that was. And actually, there was kind of a negative reaction some people had. If memory serves, Jack Nicholson was quoted as like, "Hey, I don't like that. That's not the way you do pictures."
Really? I hadn't heard that.
Yeah, again, that was a long time ago, so I could be remembering it wrong.
Well, when I read the script, I thought, this is really clever. John had done The Breakfast Club before, and that had been a sort of a update, refresher of a kind of an abandoned genre where people are stuck by circumstance in a room and they share their private lives with each other. I mean, it's been done before, but he refreshed it. And when I read Ferris, I thought, oh, this is just like Alfie. In 1966, in one of Michael Caine's first films, he played a character called Alfie who talked to the camera. And I hadn't seen it in 20 years, and I thought, well, this is really smart, Yeah, I didn't know that people had a problem with it. Alfie had been successful. I mean, it wasn't unheard of to do this, I mean, I think it's wonderful. Have you seen Fleabag, by the way?
Oh yeah, yeah. No, and since you guys have done that with Ferris, it's not uncommon. It's now become part of the language again.
Well, like I say, it wasn't John's invention. It was a revival of something that had been done before.
Sometimes the revival has a much bigger impact than the first time, I suppose.
Well, Star Wars is like every picture you've ever seen, but it's all fresh and remade into it's the sword fights in the castle, Robin Hood, and it's swinging across the moat is like, a Tarzan movie, or the Indians in the canyon where the sand people are attacking, and, it's the saloon where there's a shootout in the saloon, in the cantina. So the fighter pilot sequences at the end, it's like every movie you ever saw chopped together like a fresh chopped salad and made fresh by being combined in a new way. Japanese films with Darth Vader's helmet, and there were all sorts of influences all sort of drawn together. But I mean, it was familiar and yet new at the same time.
Well, maybe that's what people are looking for.
I don't know. If people knew what people were looking for, we wouldn't have all the movies we're having now.
True enough. Something else you did in Ferris Bueller's Day Off that, again, now more than ever has become very common is that end credits scene. It seems like you can't go to the movies now without there being some sort of sequence taking place during the credits or a tag at the very end of the credits. What was it that brought about what at the time was kind of a revolutionary thing to do in a film?
Well, we had this great scene that we'd had to cut out of the movie, Rooney on the bus. And where it had originally fallen in the film, it just brought the film to a halt. And we just couldn't figure out a way to keep it in where it had been designed to be. And John had, on the day that he shot Ferris in the shower, when he's talking to camera, he had improvised some bits where Ferris looks into the camera and says, what are you doing here? Go home, it's over. And he did some variations on that, Jim, is that you? Is that Jim? He did various things, and we decided, he wanted to put this thing at the end. And I said, John, if we put this thing at the end, people are going to walk out as soon as the credits start to roll. They're not going to see this, So that was the two motors to this solution that came up, which is how do you keep people in their seats so they can see the tag at the end? And how do we get this scene back in the movie? And it came to me one morning in the shower. I thought, oh, we could put the bus scene in a panel on the left and run the credits on the right, and that way people stay to watch, and then we'll get to the tag and people still be in the theater watching. So we did that. We prepared it and we previewed it. And sure enough, as soon as the credits started to roll, people started to leave. And then when the scene started to play, they stopped in the aisle and turned back and to watch. And it worked just as we had hoped.
So I want to ask you what might be kind of a pointed question about John, but I kind of feel like I have to ask you this. You make a point about just the enormous amount of footage that he shot. And also in the book and also in this interview, you talked about sometimes where you get too much coverage, it sort of indicates the director doesn't have a clear vision of what they want. Was that kind of how you felt about John, or was it hard to discern what it was he wanted? You really sort of found it in the editing room, or was it always there in the script?
Well, John had this God-given ability, I guess. He was graced by the gods of screenwriting. He would go into these sort of trances, I guess, and start writing. And when he was writing, there were strict instructions that he is not to be disturbed. And he would write these fantastic first drafts and never revise them. And he would turn it into the studio. And I guess at first they would ask for changes, but by this time he had had some success. And he would write these things, and the studio was faced with either green lighting it or rejecting it, but he wouldn't make any changes, and he wouldn't let anyone else rewrite it either. So we would shoot these long scripts, knowing they were too long, and do the editing process only after it had been committed to film, which is not the most efficient way to do this. There are many cuts that we could have made on the page and not bothered shooting, but that's not the way he worked. He had a gift. I mean, he wrote extraordinarily funny stuff. He's one of the funniest men I've ever known in my life. He would have me in tears for hours on end. And yeah, I mean, he would shoot. Sometimes it was hard to know what he had in mind. And
we talked about in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, he shot 8 hours of footage on the Doobie scene alone, the ride that Del and Neil take from the airport to the hotel. Like 8 hours on what ends up being just a 30-second scene in the movie?
Well, yeah. Well, on the page, it was about a quarter of a page. You know, I forget the description exactly. I mean, I could find the script and read it. But the gag was, how come we didn't take the interstate? He says, well, on the interstate, all you see is the interstate. You know, this guy's proud of his hometown. He wants to show you show you where he lives, you know. And Steve says, but it's night. So that was the gag. That was it. So then it became this long sequence where the Doobie was saying, well, see that building over there? That's where I lost my virginity. When, you see that tree that looks like a hanging tree that, he starts telling stories about all these places he went through. And of course, there was no time for this in the context of the film. So we wound up cutting it all out. And in the finished film, it's pretty much back to the way it was written. But this is the way John operated. He wanted to see, the longer version first.
The audience previews of that film, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, they weren't particularly kind in the early previews. And you've found a pretty creative solution to fix that in the end, and in the sort of turn at the end where you realize that his wife has passed and that he doesn't have a home, the whole L sequence on the train. Tell me a little bit about how you guys figured out how to make that scene really land.
Well, originally as written, Del sees Neil off. Neil gets off the train in the suburbs. He goes into the suburban station. And he trips over Del's trunk once again. And he looks up and Del is sitting there. And he says, Del, what are you doing here? He says, I got one of the truck drivers to give me a lift. And he said, well, why aren't you home? Why don't you go home? And he says, well, I don't have a home. And then he goes into this long scene describing how his wife had passed. And, it's Christmas time. He likes, he attaches himself to people. And we had the scene put together. And in this early screenings, people started to laugh. And it was not a good laugh. It was, it was not meant to be funny. And people were laughing at this speech. It was meant to be touching, but it was not getting the reaction we wanted. So we thought, well, this is terrible. So then at a certain point, we got the idea of letting Neil figure it out on his own without being told. So we constructed this sequence of flashbacks to moments in the film had hinted at the fact that Del was homeless. And then we cut to Neil going back to the station where he had left Del in the first place. We only had one shot of the train leaving the station, so we ran it backwards to see it arriving at the station that it had left from. And he gets off and he finds Del and he says, "Come on, come home with me." So it was better for Neil's character for him to figure it out on his own and didn't have this problem scene where we were getting bad laughs. And it took us a while to do that, but it's a great example of rewriting through editing.
Because we're so close to the U.S. Thanksgiving and talking about planes, trains, and automobiles, that's become a holiday staple. When that's on, as it invariably will be at Thanksgiving, will you sit down and watch it, or is this like, no, I don't need to watch that?
I don't watch my old films. I did see it. There was a retrospective screening of Ferris and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles at the time of John's death. And I got a chance to see those pictures with an audience then, a few years ago now. And that was very rewarding because it was seeing it with an audience. And for me, people talk about the big screen as opposed to the little screen. And for me, the big difference is not the size of the screen, but the size of the audience. If you see a movie, especially a comedy, with a packed house, it's a whole different experience. It's really something to treasure. And I'm really unhappy about the direction that the film business is going with turning everything into streams. I think once you remove the event aspect of watching a movie and turn it into like electricity or water, you turn the faucet and it's on, it's just always there. I think you're debasing the human experience of it. And it's like a death mask of the thing that it had been. It's not fun for me to see one of my movies on TV. I'll watch maybe 10 minutes of it, say, well, that's enough of that. But I will be appearing at a screening of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles this year in Chicago at the Music Box Theater. James Hughes, John's son, was invited to appear at this screening, and he invited me to join him, so I agreed. And it's on November 20th, and we're going to show Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and I'm sure it's going to be great because we're going to have a full house, I'm pretty sure. And James and I will talk about his dad and my experience working on the picture.
Well, I remember seeing that in the theater when it came out as a kid, and just you missed jokes because you were laughing so hard. And you're so right about the communal audience experience where you just the bathroom scene in the hotel where Neil's washing his face with Del's dirty sock water, and then he's drying his face with Del's underwear. I mean, the laughter must have rolled for about 5 minutes straight when I saw that. So I totally understand what you're saying about the theater experience.
Interesting note about that scene. A friend of mine who teaches editing told me he showed that sequence to his class, and in the morning they wake up and they're kind of spooning in bed, and then they wake up and they realize what they're doing, and they jump up and they start strutting around and acting macho, and how about those bears, and the scene did not get a laugh, and the class did not appreciate that humor. They were not in tune with that. The homophobic joke was not received well. It's a different era.
The thing about these films is they are of their time, and one of the great things about films is they mark the time, that it's a historical record, and you have this great career of films to look back upon that all do that. And as I always do, I say I'm done with questions, and then I think of, oh no, I got to ask him this, because this isn't in the book. You talked in the book about Carrie and how you wouldn't change anything about that film. You liked it just the way it is.
Yeah.
And I wondered if there was one film of yours that you could go back and change, what film is it and what would you change?
Oh, geez. Looking over the 40 films I looked at. What film? Oh, gosh. Well, like I said, I don't watch them, so I don't have those thoughts.
Well, good. Well, let's just assume they're all perfect the way they are. Okay, last quote. From now on, Paul always gets linen napkins.
Yeah. It's in the book. You'll have to read it.
Well, there you have it. I guess you can consider that the highly abridged audiobook version of Paul's book. And as much as we covered, it's seriously just the beginning of what you'll discover when you actually read it. We didn't even get into Empire Strikes Back, or Footloose, or Falling Down, and a whole bunch of others. They're all in there, and the anecdotes and insights are there to go along with them. So don't forget to subscribe to the Rough Cut Podcast to win your own, and in all likelihood, it will be an autographed hard copy edition of Paul's book. It has the Rough Cut Podcast gold seal of approval, for whatever that's worth. That's another way of saying I loved it, and I know you will too. I hope you enjoyed our talk with Paul today. I want to thank him for not only the time he gave us for this interview, but of course for the many, many years of editing some of our favorite films. Let's all keep celebrating the men and women who make these films. I will do my part by keeping the show going as long as I can. For now, though, it's time to call it a wrap on this one. As always, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me here on The Rough Cut.